Greetings! Thank you for joining me for this overview of Commissioner's Regulations, Part 154. I am Kathy Lowell, and I am representing the Hudson Valley Regional Bilingual Education Resource Network, or the HV-ARBERN. My contact information is listed on this page. Our website, hudsonvalleyarbern.org, is also listed here. You can visit our website to join our mailing list and review upcoming workshops, also to access our resources. You can find this presentation, the static form of this presentation, in our Workshop Presentations folder under CR Part 154. This recording is located on the Hudson Valley ARBERN YouTube channel or on the New York State ARBERN On Demand. In this session today, we're going to take a look at some ELL demographics in New York State and in the region to build some background. We will talk about what CR Part 154 is and what it regulates. We will talk about its connection to the blueprint for ELL Success and ELLs in the Next Generation standards, as well as the New York State Seal of Biliteracy. We're going to start off with some acronyms first, just to make sure that we are speaking the same language. We know that in our education world, there are many, many acronyms, so let's just make sure we clarify these first. We'll start off with ELLs, or English Language Learners, written as ELLs. We also use multilingual learners for the students. Students who are ELLs and MLLs participate in programs known as English as a New Language. They're taught by teachers that we often say ENL teachers, but these teachers have TESOL or ESOL certification, English for Speakers of Other Languages. We'll talk about the role of the HLQ, the Home Language Questionnaire, and the ELL Identification Process, as well as the New York State Identification Test for English Language Learners, the NYSED, and the role of the NYSED in the ELL Identification Process. We will talk about the annual proficiency exam for English Language Learners called the New York State English as a Second Language Achievement Test, or the NYSED. We will also touch on the Language Proficiency Team and the role it has in the identification of possible ELLs who already have an IEP or a 504 plan. And we'll also talk about the identification of and briefly talk about the support of students with interrupted, inconsistent formal education, also known as SIFE students. Here is a chart that shows the trend of the enrollment of ELLs in New York State from 10 school years from 2007-2008 to the 2017-2018 school year. This table shows our Hudson Valley region schools that have the highest percentages of English language learners. You can see that most of them are located in Westchester County, but there are also several school districts in Rockland and Orange County that have high populations, high percentages of English language learners. Our English language learners are enrolled in every grade from kindergarten through 12th grade. The formal process for ELLs starts in kindergarten. Most of our ELLs are enrolled in our elementary schools in kindergarten through 5th or 6th grade, if you will. It's 5th grade in this chart. And that's because many of our students are entering in our primary grades, kindergarten and 1st grade, and others may enter at any point after that. Middle school and high school have smaller percentages, one because the grade bands are a little bit smaller, but some of our students are long-term ELLs where others will exit out before they even reach middle school and high school. But yet we do have newcomers that are coming in at all levels, middle school and high school. So you can see that, again, about a quarter, a little bit more than a quarter of our ELLs in high school are in high school. The data.nysed.gov site is a great place to go if you want more information about our English language learners. Recently, a tab has been added that you can use for districts and for counties that shows the percentages of English language learners as well as the top 5 languages they speak and the enrollment, whether students are newcomers, developing English language learners, long-term ELLs and former ELLs. You could also take a look at other demographic information, just like we have in this chart here. This chart has information about ELLs across New York State compared to all students, but then we do the same thing for our counties in our Hudson Valley ARBERN region, in our catchment area. I think it's interesting to point out that the rate of ELLs in New York State is 9%. Rockland County has a higher percentage of ELLs than the rest of the state, if you will, the average of the rest of the state. Westchester is about the same rate as the New York State as a whole. I think it's important to take a look at these other categories that our students fall into, ELLs and non-ELLs. If you take a look at the students with disability column, you'll notice in the royal blue, that is all students. You will notice that when you take a look at English language learners, the identification rate for English language learners as also having a disability is higher than just students who are not ELLs, who have disabilities. And the reason for that is when ELLs struggle, it can be difficult to determine whether or not there is a need for more support in language acquisition, or if the student truly does have a learning disability. It is really important that districts do their due diligence, though, in really knowing a student, taking a look at the history of that student, both with the language proficiency development as well as academics, to really determine if the student does have a disability or not, or if there's a language acquisition need of support there. It's also interesting to note that in our economically disadvantaged column, we have a higher rate of ELLs who fall into that economically disadvantaged category than all students. The reason why I like to bring this up is because we have to, for all students, consider their access to healthcare, to social emotional support, to other supports, including stable housing. We know that when we take a look at our next column also, we do have many of our English language learners are considered homeless or in temporary housing. I think it is really important to take a look at the graduation and dropout rates as well. Our graduation rates for the four-year cohort for ELLs is much lower, significantly lower in many of our counties compared to all students, and that's definitely something that we need to address. And then along with that, our dropout rate for ELLs is significantly higher than it is for all students. So these are things that districts really need to pay attention to. And near the end of this slide, I'll talk about a toolkit that districts are encouraged to use to really take a look at the graduation rate for English language learners and things that can be done to prevent students from dropping out. Our home languages in the Hudson Valley are really interesting. While Spanish is the most common home language across New York State, it is in the Hudson Valley as well. But it's interesting to point out that we do have many other languages. First, let's start off with that other 6%. There are approximately 106 other home languages other than English that are found in our Hudson Valley schools, spoken by families. Yiddish, Japanese, Haitian Creole, Arabic, Chinese, Portuguese, and Urdu make up the other most common languages in the Hudson Valley. All right, so now let's get right into what this presentation is all about. What is the Commissioner's Regulations Part 154? First of all, we have to know where it came from. So under the federal government, Title III funding is provided to states in support of ELLs and immigrants if those states meet the criteria set forth by the federal government. In New York State does that through the Commissioner's Regulations Part 154, providing funding to districts who are meeting the regulations for English language learners and multilingual learners. The New York State LEP aid bilingual educational categorical funds supplement local funding. Well, this all comes back to a couple of landmark court cases. One, at the federal level, Lau versus Nichols in 1974, the New York State Supreme Court established the right of English language learner students to have a meaningful opportunity to participate in the educational program. And right here in New York State, we have New York City Board of Education versus Aspira. An agreement between the New York City Board of Education and Aspira of New York assured that ELL students would be provided bilingual education. For more information about these landmark cases, you can click the link at the bottom of this page in the static version. What does CR Part 154 regulate? Well, we're going to go through the list here. I'll just pop them up. I'm not going to read them as I highlight them. You can certainly read that on your own. It's a long list, right? So we'll just pause here. As I pop up the question, I will read this, but think about this. I'll give you a moment to think about it, and then we'll talk about this. So the language proficiency team reviews every home language questionnaire to determine which students are administered the NYSED. Is this true or false? If you said false, you are correct. While there is a role of the language proficiency team in ELL identification, the language proficiency team is designed to take a look at the language history of a student who is a potential ELL who already has an IEP from any one of the 50 US states or from a US territory such as Puerto Rico. We'll get into a little bit more detail in that in a few minutes. However, every single HLQ has to be reviewed, and there's a process that would then lead to a screening and a potential NYSED, and we'll get into those details as we move forward here. So the ELL identification process is articulated under CR Part 154, and districts must have an ELL identification process in place that involves the home language questionnaire, the NYSED, SIFE screening, and the language proficiency team. There's a flowchart that looks like this that details the screening process. And note, from enrollment date, the ELL identification process and program placement must be completed within 10 school days. The flowchart outlines the step-by-step process, and you can find it linked here. I want to note also that within those 10 days, students are to be enrolled immediately as soon as all of the paperwork is in and the district gives the go-ahead for the students to be present in class. That's when the 10-day time frame starts ticking, if you will, the school day time frame. However, putting students into a placement based on a best guess in those first couple of days while the screening is taking place is certainly appropriate, and then the student can be moved accordingly. Note also that there is a 45-day review window during which a teacher, the parent, a student, an administrator can put a note in writing to the building principal if they question that the ELL identification process was carried out the way it's supposed to be for a given student. For example, if a student was not identified as an English language learner for whatever reason, and somebody feels within those first 45 school days that the student might be, they would write a note to the building principal, who then must start a review process. Or the other way around. We know that students who are English language learners may have just had a traumatic migration experience, might be entering a school setting that's very unfamiliar, and they're sitting in a screening process with somebody who is unknown to them. So a student may not be as verbal in English and produce work samples in English, even if they're capable of doing so, just because of all of these experiences that I've just mentioned. And a student may not demonstrate true proficiency if they have it in English. And the student like that might be identified as an ELL, but within a couple of weeks of being comfortable in school, perhaps a student like this is demonstrating high levels of proficiency, and somebody's questioning whether they really are an ELL or not. And again, that's a great example of how you would use that 45-day window for the review process, writing a letter to the building principal, stating the evidence, and the building principal would have to start a review process. In some cases, districts find a chart like this to be helpful, creating one that talks about the role of the individuals in the ELL identification process. For example, the purple box talks about what the registrar would do. The blue box talks about what the ELL teacher would do. There's a reminder about the language proficiency team meeting and a SIFE screener. So some districts might find doing something like this helpful. This is not a piece in regulation. This is just a helpful tool. If you'd like access to a chart like this that you can then modify for your district, certainly reach out and I can send you a copy of this. You could also find this in our resources in our ELL identification folder on our website. The HLQ. This is a legal document that is used in the ELL identification process. It starts off with just gathering some basic demographic information about the child. On the left-hand side, you'll notice that the bottom part of that left side, language background, that is one of the most critical parts of this home language questionnaire. These 7 language questions must be asked, And a family can write this, and this HLQ is also available in 41 languages. So families that are not able to read in English can have this presented to them, should have this presented to them in their home language. An interpreter certainly is recommended to be used, especially when a family has a language other than English. There's also a Montrolingua pen pal that districts were provided with that translates the HLQ placemat. Definitely helpful. But anyway, this language section here, if any section on this part of this home language questionnaire indicates any other language other than English, then a screening process is warranted with an ELL teacher or a certified teacher who is trained to do so, or an administrator. Then the next part of this, the educational history, which is on the top right-hand side, there are some really important pieces that I'll mention here in a little bit more detail after this. But this is the educational history. It asks about if the students had any difficulties or struggles, how long they've been in school, and then also, is there anything else you think is important for the school to know about your child? And then question 12, in what languages would you like to receive information from the school? Districts are required to capture that information and, to the extent possible, communicate with the family in that language. Then the parent signs the HLQ here and writes the relationship to the student. And then the next box is the local signatures. The registrar must sign the first box here. I would print and sign. And if the interpreter was used, that person also has their name and their credentials on here. After that, every single home language questionnaire is reviewed by a qualified personnel. The qualified personnel is a certified New York State teacher or administrator who has the TESOL or bilingual certification, or whom is trained in cultural responsiveness and language acquisition and can appropriately administer a screening or ensure that the screening process is carried out by somebody with appropriate certification. So every single HLQ, whether they're English or only, English or other language, English only or another language, sorry, is signed up through this point. If a student has English only listed on the HLQ, once this signature is on here, then the HLQ gets filed in the student's cumulative folder. If any other language is indicated here, as I mentioned before, the screening process must take place. And if there's any other language other than English and a student already has an IEP, and you'll notice 10C up at the top is a place that you would look to check that. If 10C is checked yes, and there's any other language, then the language proficiency team must meet. This is in regulations for students entering from kindergarten, like going from the CPSE to the CSE process, entering kindergarten with an IEP, or at any other point up through 12th grade. This language proficiency team meets, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Back to the screening interview. If it's deemed during the screening interview that the student is English proficient, this box is checked off and nothing further is needed. This would be then filed in the student's cumulative folder. However, if it is deemed during that screening interview that there's a question or that it's known that a student would need support with English proficiency, then the NYSED is administered, and the results would be listed on here. Also, if a student is a potential SIFE student, a student with interrupted formal education, that information should be listed on here as well. So I mentioned that in the educational history, there are a couple of questions that you can look at. One of them, question 8, could help us identify pretty quickly whether or not a student might be a student who is a SIFE student, a student with interrupted or inconsistent formal education. You would look at the total number of years a student has been enrolled in school and compare it to a student's age. For example, if you have a 15-year-old student in New York State schools, you would expect a 15-year-old to have about 10 years of formal education. If a 15-year-old enrolls and they only have 3 or 4 years of education, of school involvement, that could indicate a possible need for a SIFE screener. So during the registration process and the review of this HLQ, that should be flagged so that the person who is screening the student knows to also use the SIFE screener and possibly administer the multilingual language screener. And then question 10C, as I mentioned before, if a student is a potential L who already has an IEP, then a language proficiency team would need to meet. And then I highlighted again that number 12, in what languages would you like to receive information from the school? After parents fill out that educational history section on there, the parents sign before the registrar signs and then the qualified personnel signs. So other than the parents, there should be at least two other district signatures on the HLQ. This flowchart here describes the SIFE identification process. Again, a SIFE student is a student who does not have the same number of years of formal education as a student we would expect. So it needs to be investigated because students who are SIFE students need a lot more support, especially to close educational gaps as well as to help meet social emotional needs and put students on the path towards graduation and careers and college. So that question 8, as I mentioned before, is the key place to look. So a student might be a SIFE student if they are an English language learner enrolled in U.S. schools less than a year, and there's evidence of inconsistent participation in a formal education program, resulting in the student performing 2 or more grade levels behind in reading and/or in math in their home language. If there's any indication of inconsistent enrollment in a school setting, a SIFE screening interview must be conducted with the student by qualified personnel in the student's home language. Parents or guardians may be included. The SIFE interview is available in 8 languages. It probes about family and home background, educational history, language and literacy practices, future plans, and asks the student to perform some performance tasks. If through that information there is more evidence that the student is a SIFE student, then the Multilingual Literacy Screener, the MLS, is used to determine literacy and math levels. That link here will take you right to the Multilingual Literacy Screener, but it has reading, vocabulary, writing, and math components. It's computer-based. Headphones are needed. Administration time is 5 to 45 minutes depending upon a student and their proficiency level and their literacy level in their home language. The reading and math is currently available in 8 languages. That will and does increase pretty consistently. And results in the ranges of performance range from grades 3 through 9. Students who are performing below grade 3 literacy is a foundational literacy level or lacking foundational literacy in reading and in writing, and those students really need very intentional, targeted foundational literacy supports. Students who are performing a grade 9 or above, it's anticipated that they should not need a tremendous amount of support with the content and concepts at the high school level. This is a flowchart for potential ELLs enrolling who already have an IEP or a 504 plan from one of the U.S. states or a U.S. territory. The guidance document is very clear about what must happen here. So again, if the review of the HLQ, you notice that the student has an IEP from another state who is potentially an ELL. The registrar notifies an administrator that a language proficiency team will need to meet. Within the 10-day time window, the LPT must take place and all LPT members must be present. The administrator requests documents from the person who conducted the interview, the parent and/or a CSE if it was held in a previous district or location, or state, I should say. Begin evaluating and collecting the evidence such as work samples, school records, bilingual evaluations, and the IEP. So the language proficiency team is a committee of individuals with expertise in the areas of second language acquisition and disabilities collectively. And the team has to review the relevant information to determine whether a student with a disability appears to have second language acquisition needs or that there is evidence that the student's disability is the determinant factor affecting whether the student could demonstrate proficiency in English during the initial screening. In other words, the disability is the reason why the student could not demonstrate English proficiency during the interview, would not pass the NYSED test. So basically though, if a student is deemed to have any needs for support in English because they're an English language learner, because they have not had a lot of exposure to English, then this team would basically say that the student needs to take the NYSED. The NYSED is the only identification test used in New York State. It's used even for students with disabilities at this time. So if during the registration process, it's noticed that a student has an IEP or a 504 from a U.S. state or territory, and the student may be an English language learner, then an LPT must be convened. Here are the members that would sit on the LPT. Notice that parents and guardians must be included. And the team reviews evidence from a parent interview, the history of student language use and exposure, any special education evaluations, and remember that all students who are bilingual are entitled to a special education evaluation. You're also looking at the IEP and school records to explore whether the student may have English acquisition needs. So we talked already about who this applies to, but it does not apply to a new student suspected of having a disability without documentation of a disability, a student coming from another country with documentation from that country indicating that the student has a disability but does not have an IEP from the United States, because IEPs from other places are not compliant with IDEA, so the LPT would not apply to that student. Also, it does not apply to a transfer student with an IEP or 504 from another school district in New York State who is already screened for ELL status. Oh, just before we move on here, I just wanted to point out that in the ELL identification process, if a student leaves New York State schools for 2 or more years and returns, the ELL identification process starts all over from the beginning. If a student leaves New York State schools and returns within 2 years, the ELL identification process does not start again. The NYSED is not given again. Students are provided with service at the most recent level that we have of their proficiency for New York State. True or false? The schedule for a student who is an ELL who is at a transitioning level of proficiency must include a minimum of 180 minutes a week of integrated ELL support, of it which at least 90 minutes is in integrated ELA. If you said true, you are correct. Let's break this down a little bit more. So we have these tables called Units of Study table, which I will show in just a moment. It breaks down instruction into 2 different settings. One of them is integrated ELL methodologies in a content area instruction that's co-taught or individually taught by a dually certified teacher. So in this setting, you either have your ELL teacher working side by side in supporting students who are English language learners as well as other students in the class. You have your ELL teacher working with your classroom or your content area teacher, or you have a teacher who is dually certified in ELL and classroom or content area. And then there's also standalone ELL, really designed for students who are at the lower levels of proficiency. So ELL instruction with an ELL teacher to develop the English language needed for academic success. Within these settings, let's talk about who can be here. So standalone ELL is a K-12 ESOL certified teacher, that's English for speakers of other languages. An integrated ELL, it's either the dually certified teacher with ESOL and common branch or content, or 2 individually certified teachers, the ESOL and common branch content teachers who co-teach together. The PD requirements for all teachers, 15% of total hours of ELL-specific PD are required for all teachers with the permanent certification. 50 total hours for ELL-specific PD for bilingual and ELL teachers are required for those with professional certification. This is what the K-8 Units of Study table looks like. To read this, you would take a look at the proficiency levels at the top. Notice that there are 5 in New York State. Our lowest level is beginning, entering students, and then we have emerging, transitioning, expanding, and commanding. And notice the descriptors underneath. For example, commanding says proficient. So let's take a look at the entering level student. Here, it tells us at the bottom when you get down to total, so if you skip down a little bit down that column, there's a total of 360 minutes per week of ELL support for a student at the entering level in grades K-8. That breaks down to 1 unit of study in ELL standalone and 1 unit of study in ELL ELA. So that integrated co-taught or the dually certified teacher in an integrated ELL ELA setting. Minimally. All of these are minimum numbers. Notice though, as a student's proficiency increases, we still have that integrated co-taught ELA, and then there's some flexibility with that a little bit later, but entering and emerging level students definitely get the standalone, but when you get to a transitioning level student, you could still use a half a unit of study in standalone or in integrated ELL core content area, but yet still the students do require that support in the integrated ELL ELA setting. It's a quick example of how to read the chart. The information at the bottom with the staffing is what we just went through in the previous slide. It is important to note two other things. The maximum allowable grade span is 2 contiguous grades for grouping instruction in ELL or ESL and bilingual education programs. The other thing I wanted to point out was for the commanding level student. Once a student reaches commanding level, they would be considering Exit L status, but for 2 years, students still get additional supports. There are 2 ways that can be provided. One of those means is through a half a unit or 90 minutes a week of units of study support in an integrated setting, such as ELA or other content areas. Notice it says or, and that's underlined, other approved former ELL services for 2 additional years. There is a guidance document that details other approved former ELL services, but it really goes back to using evidence of the student performance in English and providing targeted support in any area where the student is not yet as proficient as maybe in the other areas. We find often through looking at the NYSED results that many students may not be as highly proficient in their writing area, yet all other modalities, the speaking, listening, and reading, may be higher, and a student might need some more targeted support in writing to ensure their academic success, and that could happen through some of those other approved former ELL services. For example, AIS, or with the ELL teacher consulting with the ELA teacher. We have the 9 through 12 units of study here, and the biggest difference here, as you'll note, is that for an entering level student, there's a bump up to 540 minutes per week of ELL support to really help ensure that the student is getting the support that he or she needs to be successful in high school. True or false? Districts must provide parents or guardians with a program orientation and provide placement for bilingual and ELL program information in writing in the parent's guardian's preferred language within 10 days. This is false. The main difference here is that it's within 5 days, 5 school days. Excuse me. Parents must be provided with the program orientation and placement information in writing in the parent's or guardian's preferred language in 5 days. This video here, we're not going to watch this now, but this is available on the Office of Bilingual Education Parent tab. This is available in multiple languages, but it describes the English as a New Language program, or ELL program. It also talks about the default for bilingual placements when that's available. True or false? Districts must provide a bilingual education program in grades K through 8 when 15 or more grade level students speak the same language across 2 contiguous grades. This is false. In New York State, under the regulations, if a district has 20 or more students in the same grade that speak the same language across the district, even collectively between their buildings, 20 or more students, the district must provide a bilingual program option to parents. They must plan for it and solicit parents' interest in the program. For more information about that, please contact the Arbor. So right here, each school with 20 or more ELL students of the same grade who speak the same home language continues to be required to provide a bilingual education program. This is the units of study table for transitional bilingual education programs for grades K through 12. Note that with the difference in the levels of proficiency and with the bilingual content area classes, there's a little bit of a difference as students increase in proficiency. Here's the 9 through 12 transitioning bilingual education program units of study. True or false? A student in grade 3 can exit ELL status by obtaining a score of expanding on the NYSED while also achieving a 3 or 4 on the New York State Testing Program ELA test in the same school year. And this answer is true. We're going to talk about the exit status now. So ELL Exit Criteria, option 1. A student who scores at the commanding level on the NYSED, the annual proficiency test, is considered to be exiting ELL status. The only other option for exit is a student who scores at the expanding level on the NYSED and has a 3 or 4 on the grade 3 to 8 ELA assessment or a 65% or higher on the English Regents exam. The one caveat with these is that they must be in the same school year. So for example, a student who on the 2019 NYSED had an expanding level and on the 2019 ELA assessment in grades 3 to 8, the student had a 3 or a 4, or with the 2019 NYSED expanding level and a 2019 English Regents, whether it be January, June, or August, and the student performed 65%, they would also be considering exit ELL status. Former ELL Services for those who exit ELL status. Here is your guidance document. We mentioned this when we were looking at the units of study table. So at least 2 years of former ELL Services to support students who exit out of ELL status, including a half unit of study in integrated ENL or ESL, in ELA Math, Science, or Social Studies. And I should point out that ESL was a term formerly used by many districts and by the state to talk about English as a second language. It has been replaced by ENL. Anyway, I digressed. So that half unit of study in an integrated setting and or with approval from the Office of Bilingual Education, other services that monitor and support language development and academic progress. And again, the guidance document for former ELL Services will provide you with the information, or you can reach out to the Arbor and we can help you with that as well. Identifying students with disabilities. So New York State adopted regulations on behalf of ELLs with disabilities. This is now Commissioner's Regulations 154.3 to improve instruction and programming and to ensure stronger outcomes and access for students who are ELLs who have disabilities. There are pre-referral factors to consider, and they are listed here. For more information on what to consider when you're considering an ELL who is struggling and the possible pathway of considering whether or not the student might have some special learning needs, we have workshops offered through the Hudson Valley Arbor, and we can also share resources and other workshops that can help districts to ensure that they're really doing due diligence in screening a child and understanding where that child's needs are as far as language acquisition and supporting students when they're struggling. So some ELLs experience academic difficulty, and we take a hypothesis-driven approach that explores external factors that impact student achievement rather than intrinsic reasons. And to do so, we're going to collect and analyze evidence and follow a process of elimination. You can look outside of the school building, and you can look inside of the school building to really understand where each child is and when they're struggling, what the reasons might be. So we call this Part 154 and Part 200, the Tale of Two regulations, where Part 200 supports students with special needs. And Part 154, as we mentioned before, is the support of English language learners. So one is not more important or more powerful than the other. Both require someone with language expertise as part of the CSE. A lack of appropriate instruction and limited proficiency in English is not a disability. And program options include transitional bilingual education, ENL, or dual language. The most important thing here is to remember that a student who is identified as both an English language learner and who has learning disabilities, they deserve the support, and districts are mandated to provide the support both for the English as a new language as well as anything mandated by the student's IEP. Neither is more important than the other. Also, seal of biliteracy comes into play here. Every year, districts have to either complete a comprehensive ELL education plan or check off an assurances page that they are still meeting all of the Part 154 requirements. This comprehensive ELL education plan is completed through the NYSED business portal, usually by an administrator. But in the comprehensive ELL education plans, it addresses programs for ELLs and subpopulations of ELLs. The state wants to make sure that districts are providing information to parents in the languages they best understand. It addresses methods to annually measure and track ELL progress. We take a look at systems to identify, assess, and exit students from ELL status. Program information by subpopulations in the district, such as SIFE, long-term ELLs, and ELLs who are also students with disabilities. So districts are required to keep a copy of their most recent comprehensive ELL education plan in every school, as well as in the district main office, and it should be available upon request for any staff member or others to review as they desire. But that is a requirement. It would be good to check with your building's office, your school building office, to take a look at the latest CEEP for your district. The most recent one was not as, it didn't have as many narratives that districts had to provide, but there were some assurances and a few short narratives this time. So here's another quick quiz. All teachers are teachers of English language learners and need to plan accordingly. This is a quote from which NYSED document? If you said blueprint for ELL Success, you are correct. The blueprint for ELL Success starts off with Principle 1. All teachers are teachers of English language learners and need to plan accordingly. There are 8 principles to provide guidance, resources, and support to educational leaders and educators, as well as to promote understanding of and appreciation for bilingualism and biliteracy. I flip-flopped these 2 bullets as I went into this, so pardon me. But the top bullet, the blueprint for ELLs, clarifies expectations and provides guidance for administrators, policymakers, and practitioners to prepare ELLs for success, pre-K through 12, and to provide the foundation for college and career readiness. If you have not read this, it's not a very long document. It is very helpful to see what the expectations are, and the 8 principles are certainly guiding principles for supporting English language learners. So the next generation standards, the next generation learning standards, and ELLs. I think it's great to note that in the next generation learning standards, English language learners and students with disabilities are included in the document, included in the considerations from the very beginning. So there's a pressing need to provide instruction that not only meets but exceeds standards as part of a system-wide initiative to promote equal access to advanced literacy for all learning while capitalizing on linguistic and cultural diversity. And then ELLs and MLLs are expected to meet the same grade level standards as all other students, and each ELL or MLL is therefore entitled to instructional supports, scaffolds, and services that support him or her to get there. New York State also wants to highlight that they recognize the value of biliteracy by offering the seal of biliteracy to students who can demonstrate that they are biliterate. So this capitalizes on linguistic and cultural diversity. So in order to do this, we would love to see all students, as many as possible, earn the seal of biliteracy. So districts can come up with their own plan, but it has to be approved by New York State, and the plan is to show that students are biliterate. It recognizes students who have attained proficiency in 2 or more languages. This serves English language learners as well as native speakers who are literate in another language. You can find more information on NYSED's site. Districts that have dual language programs from the very beginning are very excited about this opportunity for students, as are districts with strong programs for languages other than English and that have high populations of English language learners. There are some pathways for ELLs that should be considered. Alternative pathways for ELLs, for example, not all ELLs are going to have the credits that they need as they're acquiring English and content area information. They may take a little bit longer, so a 5-year cohort would certainly be appropriate, and some even 6 years. Interpretation of previous academic and life experiences can lead to some credits for some English language learners. You can contact the Arbor for more information on that. There is an appeals process for the English Regents. Students can earn between 55 and 65 if they are an ELL and meet other criteria. And then an elimination of a social studies regent if a student enters in the 11th grade cohort. And an appeal for one content regents between 60 and 65. Additionally, whoops, I thought one more was on here. Additionally, a great opportunity for students who are English language learners is to take the pathway exam. It's available in multiple languages, including Spanish and Chinese and Arabic and a few others, as well as American Sign Language. That is an option for our English language learners too, in lieu of one of the regions. True or false? Testing accommodations are no longer available to students once they exit ELL status. This is false. As we went through our units of study before, students, once they reach that commanding level or the expanding plus the 65 or higher on the regents or 3 or 4 on the ELA, are entitled to 2 more years of support, and that does include testing accommodations. And testing accommodations for ELLs include access to bilingual dictionaries and glossaries. However, students who are English language learners should be able to access these at any time, not just for assessments. Bilingual dictionaries and glossaries may provide only direct translations of words, not definitions. And as I mentioned before, the definitions are not appropriate, nor is electronic dictionaries or glossaries with internet access. During testing, that's not accessible, not permitted. Oral interpretation is also available for low incidence languages for state exams, including the 3 to 8 math assessments, science assessments, and then regents other than ELA. Also, students who are English language learners have access to extended time and separate locations. Here are some other really helpful New York State instructional resources. If you have not yet seen these are really great resources. We have our topic briefs from Dr. Noni Lasso and Emily Phillips Galloway. Talks about the access for ELLs through academic success and vocabulary and reading. Also, we have West Ed topic briefs that are really highlight how we can best support our English language learners. If you have not had the opportunity to read through those, it's highly recommended. The Culturally Responsive Sustaining Education Framework was released last school year in 2019. This is a really great resource. All districts should be taking a look at this. There are different components in here, and districts can select to use the whole toolkit or parts that they feel will benefit their programs the most and their students the most. I mentioned earlier in this presentation the MLL-ELL graduation rate and dropout prevention toolkit that's linked at the top, and also the program quality review and reflective protocol toolkit. This is another opportunity for districts to take a look at and perhaps even audit their programming for English language learners. The Arbor is available to help you with any of these toolkits, and keep an eye out for workshops related to these and work groups that we have in progress and process to support districts as they utilize and become familiar with these tools. Thank you very much. We do not at this time have an evaluation form that we're doing electronically, but please feel free to reach out with any questions or if you have any other feedback related to this. Again, thank you very much for your time.